Hello, everybody, and let's get started with interview number 3 as we come to you on day 1 of this giant mining indaba in Cape Town. We've spoken to the Group Chief Operating Officer, to the Group Chief Executive, and now let's talk in a little more detail about public sector or private sector participation. And I'm in conversation with Dr. Andrew Shaw, who's Chief of Strategy and Planning. Andrew, a very warm welcome to you. From a PSP perspective, I'd suggest to you that this year's indaba is probably the most important that you've attended over the past couple of years. Early days, but what are you looking for out of a meeting like this?
I think what we'd like to do is connect with the stakeholders out there, understand how they positioned, the role that they can play, and how do we position Transnet to be an enabler of growth. I mean, that's a critical agenda item for government, and we're owned by government. So the PSP structures are around growing not only Transnet, but growing the economy of South Africa.
Let's get to the PSP side of the equation in just a moment. But having listened in depth to the Chief Executive and the Chief Operating Officer, maybe an easier story to tell and sell this year than in previous years? And I'll ask that with a twinkle in my eye.
I think the momentum around PSPs has grown, and people are starting to understand that there's value in these structures. As Michelle very clearly indicated, is Transnet comes from a monopoly history, and it's very difficult as an organization to identify a space and a role for Transnet that is not in this public sector monopoly. And the way that we are structuring Transnet, and we talk about the R4G strategy, is to fix the business, transform the business because there's a lot of regulatory change, and then to grow the business. And the predominant way to grow the business is to enable these PSP structures that deliver way more volume, way more efficiency, and reposition Transnet in the logistics chain. And that's really critical to our future.
Within that future, how critical, how much of a central pillar within your operating and strategic direction has private sector participation become? It's growing in stature and importance, isn't it?
Yes, and I think the shareholder will push us in to grow it still further. So government is very clear about its ambitions.
What misconceptions, Andrew, still exist around PSPs?
I think the misconception that we're wholesale selling off parts of Transnet is a misconception that is always there, that we have to correct, but also identify how we structure the PSP. So an important part of designing the PSP structure to enable volume growth, efficiency, and so on is how do you actually transact? How do you go to the private sector? How do you structure that? How do you draw their capital in? How do you hold them accountable? How do you hold us accountable? That's all very critical to creating a success with PSP.
How difficult has that process been then? Because it's still early days, isn't it?
It's very early days, and we've done a number of PSP structures, but it's really the Durban Gateway Terminal. We had 2 in Durban. That is the biggest, and is our sort of lead, if you call it a pilot PSP transaction. And so we still have to work out very clearly how we're going to manage our process in respect to that transaction. And while we're doing that, we're getting into a whole range of others.
What will you be looking out for specifically as far as the Durban project is concerned, where you will draw lessons down?
Well, look, the way we position Durban is to draw in efficiency so that we're benchmarked better with global terminals. And so attracting an international terminal operator that has a lot of experience in other parts of the world is critical to that gain. So we're going to be watching that. We wish them to invest. They have already indicated that they wish to put a lot of money into the terminal. We wish to learn from them their efficiency life cycle, how they manage their equipment, how they manage people, how they manage the turnaround of vessels. So all of those learnings are really critical.
On the ground, how are you actually going to do that? Are you going to twin people together to learn? What's the process?
So the way that structure is, the way that PSP is structured is for us to have a majority stake at an equity level, 51%, and they have 49%. But they have management control in terms of being able to deliver what they need to in the terminal. So we have an equity position, so we therefore have seats on the board of this new structure, Durban Gateway Terminal. Those seats are very critical to how we will manage our delivery within that structure. What we've also done in terms of the transformation of Transnet is set up what we call a ventures portfolio, which is where we'll house each of these PSP structures in such a way that we can more effectively manage that. So we'll set in place certain targets. Are these being met? how do we interface with the board members that we have in that structure to make sure that certain deliverables are achieved, etc. So that structure is still emerging. We're working very closely with an outside consultant who's looking at the whole operating model of Transnet. So this is a core part of redesigning the Transnet of the future.
Not an easy line to toe, though, between equity partner or senior equity partner on the one side and management control on the other. Both sides are working towards a common goal, obviously, but there are also competing agendas and priorities within that relationship, right? How do you manage that? Again, early days.
It's early days. And I think we're just going to have to go in there with an attitude that we have to make sure that the key objectives are met and how are we going to structure that process. And so if we lose sight of that ball or we kind of don't pay attention to how those processes work, then I think the chance of less success is a possibility. So each of these PSP structures is going to require very hands-on involvement. And I think people in Transnet are starting to recognize the importance of positioning in that way for all of the PSPs.
Quite a culture shift, though, right? I mean, both you and Michelle have spoken about the monopoly period in the past. To get one's head around the difference is not difficult or is not easy to achieve, is it?
No, and our agenda, which Michelle spoke to previously, is to drive out 6 key PSPs and to try and keep to the dates that our shareholders committed us to, and focus on getting those out. Before we start to look at even further ones, let's get the key 6 ones done and get them out into the market. And they will have a very substantial impact on how we position and the freight and logistics industry.
And Andrew Shaw, at a senior level, I understand at a strategic level, but on a more granular level, the operational learnings that you're going to take from these private sector participants, how are you going to affect that on the ground?
Look, there will always be operations that will remain within Transnet. So the structure of Transnet will continue to exist. Government's very clear that we'll create a differentiation between operations and infrastructure. Infrastructure will be held in the hands of the state, and operations will be more and more competitive as we move forward. So taking the learnings from the PSP structures and plowing them back, particularly in the operating environment, is really, really critical, because that's where we're getting new train operating companies. I believe we'll get more competition in the ports environment. That's where we're going to have to get fit.
And this is all best practice stuff, right, from around the world.
This is really the structure of what's happened in almost all countries around the world, is that government feels the need to hold the infrastructure for strategic purposes, long-term investment purposes, drawing the private sector to invest in infrastructure, but to keep it in the hands of the state. So use a kind of a concessioning model. It's very similar to what has been done around the toll road model when respect to building big infrastructure in the form of roads. So that structure will continue to evolve over time, and we'll take learnings from that both in the infrastructure environment and in the operating environment. And if I can say, what I've seen within Transnet, particularly under Michelle's leadership, is a very significant shift and change in the thinking of particularly senior leadership across Transnet, understanding that the world is not as it was, and we're going to have to reposition for change.
Can't have been easy to do that.
No, and it's taken somebody, I think, who's taken the leadership, understood the culture of Transnet as it is, and then positioned on top of that the need for change, and slowly work through this message that we're there to deliver. And the focus of what Solly had spoken about this morning is making sure we're operationally efficient, but at the same time we ready ourselves for change in the environment.
Let me circle back to something you said at the start of this conversation about holding each other to account. How are you going to do that? I mean, what kind of processes or protocols are in place at this point?
Look, I guess the performance structure, as you would normally find in a corporate, is something that exists within Transnet, but perhaps needs to be more effective in terms of driving a degree of change. The one thing that's clear from some of the international examples is once you start to draw the private sector in, and there's a public sector historical monopoly, it tends to push them under pressure to meet the same standards. So if, for example, you're able to achieve standards of performance in the Port of Durban in one terminal, the terminal next door will not stand still. It will immediately be looking over its shoulder and saying, we need to up our game. So that will definitely come
without cutting corners.
Without cutting corners, exactly.
Which is critical to the process. I mean, it's learning from each other, but and that competitive edge is absolutely vital, providing that it's managed properly.
Yes, and I think we're going to get the same as new train operators come in. We believe we can compete with them, particularly on the big, strong, bulk volume lines. But we're also going to have to watch and see how effective are they, where are our areas of competitive advantage, where are the areas we can leverage. Transnet staff, if you travel across the country, you realize that they know this business very, very well. So, the assumption is that Transnet is inefficient. I think what we're going to do is we're going to show the private sector in certain places that actually we have been playing in a very effective role in delivering certain services across, particularly the rail, the port network.
Have some of the early engagements been a little more complex and a little more difficult than you originally thought?
In terms of engagements with the private sector and setting up the PSP models? Yes, in that, well, I think we knew that what we were going into, but we've got some lessons as to where we are. The process to actually initiate the PSPs takes inordinately long. And sometimes that's not only our process. So we have a structured process where we have to follow PFMA rules. But quite often when we go out to market, the private sector asks for additional time to bid. And it's for us an advantage to give them some time because otherwise we get poorer quality responses to our transactions. So it's generally a 2 to 2.5 to 3 year cycle from the beginning of a PSP, a complex large PSP, to actually awarding the contract. And that takes longer than I think people have the appetite for. Can we fast track that? We've sort of worked on a model where we believe we can get it down to 2 years.
Preempted my next question. How are you fast tracking? Because you'll concede there is a degree of frustration sometimes. Maybe it's just a public perception that the process is taking an inordinately long time.
I think, Jeremy, our focus, and that's why Michelle will put to us, our focus is to get the 6 PSPs that we've committed to out into the market
and working efficiently.
Yes. Instead of trying to dream up a whole range of new ones and driving that out for 2, 3, 4, 5 year cycle, is deliver what you've committed on. And so that's our target. But to come back to your timing question, we do not believe that we can do a difficult or a large scale PSP in less than a 2 year time frame. It's not possible.
Is there international best practice that you've looked at and are following in this process, or is it unique to South Africa?
South Africa has a slightly unique model because we have competition on one level, so operators can apply for slots and gain access, and then we have a shift towards a sort of structured concessional model around the PSP. So we have a sort of a balance that we've got to deliver across Transnet, which takes both of those into account. But there are some very positive learnings. So, for example, in Brazil, they did a number of big bulk infrastructure and operations concessions. They've been very successful. In Australia, there's a number of old concessions that are structured a little differently to our own ones. But again, we've looked at all these models and we've identified how we will put the structure in place and how we will take that after market.
Andrew, how difficult is it to share risk between Transnet and the public partners to ensure that the process remains not only fair, but also sustainable?
Look, I guess the risk-sharing model is something that we will have to work hard. And as you've said, we're at the beginning of this process. But we've got to share a risk in a way where we're equally rewarded for the returns that we're getting as businesses. And so as you set up one of these concession structures, for example, the one in the Port of Durban, there will be some learnings around what do we invest, how much risk do we take, what is our equal return, how do we share the rewards of that structure going forward. I think at this point, we don't have all the answers to that. We're going into
But you must have done some risk projection modeling, sure.
Yes. So we've looked at forecasts for traffic. We've looked at our ability to reposition the Port of Durban. We've looked at the risk challenges of berth deepening at that particular Pier 2 terminal, which is going to mean it's restricted from operations for a period of time. All of those risks have been looked at in terms of structuring that transaction.
So risk management is one thing, Andrew, but governance safeguards have also got to be put in place. And I'll tell you why I ask that question, because you've got to, on the one hand, serve national economic interest, but on the other hand, you've got to serve an increasingly important commercial role that Transnet has. Again, a difficult one to balance. And in many respects, we keep using this phrase early days, but you've got to make sure that you're paying attention to both of those sides of the equation, right?
Yeah, so This is where it's very important for us to align to the structure of how government sees the repositioning of the sector. So infrastructure is separated from operations. Operations is more competitive, more commercial, and infrastructure is managed by the Transnet Rail Infrastructure Manager and by Transnet National Ports Authority. So the way that those infrastructure bodies manage the quality of that infrastructure, how the level of competition is managed, how it is fair and transparent is really, really critical to the process. So in setting up those two entities, TMPA has been set up for some time, but TRIM has only really come to the market now. It's really critical to get those governance structures properly in place, transparent, and trusted by the private sector. So we're going into a different world in which infrastructure operations separate, but joined in some instances by a PSP structure, which is what we're likely to do on some of the big corridors going forward.
As this process gains traction and maturity, how difficult is it going to be to prevent fragmentation of the network without compromising the private partners themselves? I mean, it's all in the adjudication, isn't it?
Yes. So I think we have to go back to why they're structured. It's in a competitive way and including PSP structure. So government's real focus is to enhance economic growth, and Transnet is seen to be holding economic growth back by between 1.5 to 2% of GDP. So if we could fix the network, we can operationalize our full bulk export corridors, we could probably ramp up GDP by 2%. That would be significant. So what they see is the need to open up the freight logistics sector to more competition, but at the same time drive out big investments that enhance the volume throughput. So that's why there's the selection of a reform strategy which is focused on competition in operations, the setup of a PSP structure or integrated delivery across the big value chains as a way of delivering greater volumes of freight. Ultimately, the minister has her ambition around 250 million tons, whereas we're not at 180, which was at our top, was our target. So there's a big gap to fill going forward to reach that 250 million tons.
Does that consume you, that 250 target?
Yes, because she said to us, look, she's really got two key targets for us: port performance, and she's got a crane moves per hour target, and 250 million tons. She's very clear. That's what you need to get right. And so the structure of how we redesign Transnet is to deliver those two things.
So looking to the future then, how do you think PSPs are going to shape the look and feel and operational dynamic of Transnet in the next 5 years? What's the business going to look like? Again, I mean, I understand there are lots of vagaries and variables here, but what's the business going to look like, do you think, if you get this all right?
Okay, so if we fast track ourselves 10 years out, we know that
What you've obviously done. I mean,
yes.
all that work's been done, right?
All that work's been done. We know that we'll have an infrastructure set of operating divisions: Transnet Rail Infrastructure Manager, TNPA. We know we'll have a set of operating divisions, which is Transnet Engineering, Transnet Freight Rail, Transnet Pipelines, TPT. Those three will have to compete more in the market. On the right-hand side of that, you will have a series of ventures where we are in partnership with others. We may take an equity stake, we may take a majority equity stake. And those structures will need to be managed as a sort of separate ventures portfolio. And we would see our role in that as being sort of government's equity holder of a structure going forward. And so the way that Transnet looks going forward is really a competitive model under operations, a structured concession model, and then a traditional infrastructure type model. And those three have to live with one another as we go forward. And I think government's intention is ultimately that infrastructure partner may go out of Transnet. It may be managed in its own right. But we're still probably 10 years away from that.
And all of this, of course, is predicated on making sure that you have the right people in the right jobs. Always a challenge in this country, isn't it? How you get into grips with that?
Look, I think there's been a strong focus on skills, and you've heard from Solly, for example, drawing in people that played a very positive role around delivering operations, understand the network, understand the operating environment, have grown up within the Transnet model, but have delivered, and putting those people in the right place. So part of our role is to relook at our operating model, and that's a process that, as I indicated, we are busy with at the moment. That's about repositioning all these different moving parts of Transnet, and then making sure that we fill those positions with the right people. Some of that is looked at delayering, in other words, being less layer intensive in Transnet, trying to collapse some of the layers. some of it has been making sure you have the right people with the right skills to fill the right gaps in the structure.
I mean, it's astonishing because what you're doing is you're redesigning the train and the network at the same time that you've got to keep it going at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah. That's not easy, right?
No, it's extraordinarily difficult. And I think sometimes people within Transnet are not sure exactly how they fit into the structure. So reinforcing this message, the R4G strategy, it's driven by 3 pillars. Transform the business, which is about operations. Fix the business. Transform the business, which is about meeting the reform environment that government has now created. We'll have a rail act that will shortly come through, which will really be very clear.
And you're through phase 1.
We're through phase 1.
Yeah.
We're already in this process. And on the right-hand side, grow the business. And growing the business is around drawing in partners that were willing to invest in the network and willing to invest in operations to improve both operational performance and volume delivery. That's what we would like to see. So that's in a sort of nutshell. That's what R4G is all about. It's those 3 pillars.
Dr. Andrew Shaw, Chief of Strategy and Planning at Transnet, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Good luck going forward. Tough job.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.